Hello, I hope you're well this week. Now, before we look very quickly at Block's second chapter, a quick recap. My thesis for this module, as you can see, is the Church's communal activity and mission is more complete with persons with disabilities than it is without. In order to demonstrate that thesis to some degree, in this video you will be examining, and I hope building, on some of Nancy Eiesland's work. You'll do so by using Jenny Weissblock's multi-layered definition of disability as an indirect connection to questions of the Church as a community. Let us start with context. Jenny Weissblock, OP, pictured on the slide, is a Dominican Catholic laywoman and practical theologian who has decades of experience as an accessibility advocate. She was married to one Sandy Block, but he died, thus she's a widow. Her entire book, Copious Hosting, A Theology of Access for Persons with Disabilities, is a revision of her master's thesis. As a whole, that slim text contains numerous profound perspectives on the relations of disability and theology. In this brief chapter, Block asks 3 simple and profound clusters of questions, which you can see on the slide. What is disability, and who is disabled? Are we all disabled? And what are we afraid of? These sort of comprise the lecture goals for this time around. Now, let me show you how Block complements what you've learned about disability so far from Eiesland, starting with her first question. When she asks, what is disability and who is disabled? Block intends to define disability in terms that lay people can understand. Because you didn't get that definition from Eiesland, let me add it here. According to Block, as you can see, disability has multiple meanings. Feminist scholar of disability Susan Wendell defines it as, quote, socially constructed from a biological reality, end quote, while the Americans with Disabilities Act, the federal legislation in this country that enshrines civil rights for Americans with disabilities, offers a 3-part definition. First, disability is a physical or intellectual impairment that limits a person's activities. Second, it's a record of that impairment. And third, it's a social construction where someone is regarded as having that impairment. Al Condalucci also points out that bridging the gap between an impairment and one's environment, that is getting in between the person and his or her environment to offer them a helping hand, can remove the impairment. Block also goes back to Wendell's definition to observe that the primary causes of disability are multifactorial. Second, Block asks, are we all disabled? Here the answer is much clearer. No. Not everyone faces social discrimination based on their physical, intellectual, and/or emotional capacity. Now, after touching on Charles Gurney's, Barbara Blodgett's, and Andrew Solomon's answers to her question, Block basically asserts that both extremes of the problem miss the point. Saying that everyone is disabled trivializes the conditions of people with disabilities, whereas saying that no one is disabled diminishes the enormity of the social norms that people with disabilities face every day. Block further argues, and I quote, people with disabilities cope with particular problems that are not experienced by non-disabled people, and people without disabilities do them an injustice by not recognizing and attempting to understand their uncommon situations. Eiesland also notes something like that elsewhere in Disabled God, especially when, in the final chapter, she writes about the inaccessibility of the communion rite. Because of our acute physical and intellectual needs, people with disabilities demand understanding rather than blank looks, uncomfortable laughter, or patronizing help. Now, Block attempts to argue immediately after that assertion that she's just made that people with and without disabilities can share solidarity in the sharing of the human condition from which no one is exempt. End quote. I am not certain it is that simple. We're all human, it's true. And we can all get along, it's true. But people with disabilities expand the definition of humanity so that we, people with and without disabilities within the church can see all of God's intention for humanity. Third, Block asks, what are we afraid of? By we, Block means people of able body. She suggests that pain, suffering, and death are the content of the fear that people of able body feel in the presence of disability. As you can see on the slide, she says it like this. We struggle to make sense of disability. The suffering that we see scares us. The fear of becoming disabled makes us uncomfortable. People with disabilities assault our cultural norms. We search for security in our values of attractiveness, independence, self-sufficiency, and productivity. We are startled by the thought that God might not care if we are attractive, independent, and productive, and so we keep our distance. Everything that Block says in that paragraph is true, on some level anyway. So it doesn't really require a lot of unpacking. Disability makes people of able body, as well as those with disabilities, uncomfortable, all of us alike. We do aspire, all of us alike, to ideals of, quote, independence, self-sufficiency, and productivity that aren't really attainable, and the discomfort that disability causes can allow people of different kinds of ability to keep their distance from each other. That's pretty straightforward. That said, this is why a short explanatory chapter on disability matters to an exploration of ecclesiology. The Church's communal activity and mission is more complete with persons with disabilities than it is without. We who have disabilities matter, both because we are neighbors to those without, and because we disclose God's grace in all its revelatory power through our capacity and our vulnerability. We are your neighbors, insofar as everyone I'm talking to on this video knows someone who has a disability or a chronic illness. We are a part of your lives, and we disclose God's grace because we both require and extend hospitality to others in our relative weakness, our bodily ambiguity, and our unconventional modes of perception. That is where Block's last quotation comes into play. In light of disabilities throwing into confusion the ideals of perfection and self-control, Block claims, and I quote, disability brings the eschatological horizon into sharp focus, end quote. As I said above, people with disabilities extend the definition of humanity, and because of our openness to God's power in our limitation, believers with disabilities can testify to the extension of God's kingdom as well. In the presence of disability, the kingdom of God comes near. Which, naturally, is a good place to stop and recap. In this short video, you've done 4 small but very significant things with my guidance. First, you've used Block's work in creative tension with Eiesland's in order to broaden your definitions of disability. Second, you've examined a critical assumption made by many people with able bodies that human beings are all disabled, and critiqued it pretty stringently because people with disabilities face problems that most people do not in terms of our social statuses and functional limitations. Third, you've asked with Block what people of able body are afraid of, and established that the discomfort they feel in the presence of disability emerges from the nearness of pain, suffering, and death. Fourth, and furthermore, you've discerned why these matters are integral to ecclesiology and ministry. That's a good place to stop for just a moment. When you're ready, please go on to the next video. Thank you.